In 48 hours, the most heartless man in America would be crying in the arms of someone he once tried to destroy. Here's how it happened. But first, let me know in the comments, where are you watching this from? The morning sun cast long shadows across Meridian Park, one of the most exclusive green spaces in Manhattan. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Alexander Voss stepped out of his black Bentley, adjusting his $5,000 suit as he prepared for his daily power walk through his park. At 55, Alexander had built a corporate empire worth $2.8 billion, but his success had come at a price. Those who knew him described him with words like ruthless, cold, and calculating. The business magazines called him a genius. His employees called him something else entirely. "Excuse me, Mr. Voss," his assistant Jennifer's voice crackled through his Bluetooth earpiece. "The Peterson merger needs your final approval by—" "Later," Alexander cut her off, his steel-gray eyes already locked onto his target. "I have more pressing matters to attend to." 50 yards ahead, near the ornate fountain that bore his family's name, a black woman in a worn city uniform was emptying trash bins. Beside her, an 8-year-old girl sat cross-legged on the ground, drawing something in a coloring book with the intense concentration that only children possess. This was Kira Bennett, 42, a single mother who worked for the city's parks department. And this was Luna Bennett, her daughter, whose bright smile could light up the darkest room. What Alexander didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he was looking at the two people who would either destroy him or save his soul. The choice would be theirs, not his. Alexander's expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the pristine walkway as he approached them with the purposeful stride of a man who had never been told no. His face was already twisted into the expression of disgust that had become his signature look whenever he encountered what he called undesirables in his space. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that came from owning half the city. "This is a private park. You need to move along." Kira looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting his with a calmness that unsettled him. There was something in her gaze, not fear, not anger, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like ... recognition. "The park is public until 6 p.m., sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor Alexander didn't notice. "We have every right to be here, right?" Alexander laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Do you see that fountain behind you? That's the Voss Memorial Fountain. My family donated $12 million to keep this park beautiful, and I won't have it turned into a playground for people who don't belong here." Luna looked up from her coloring book, her large brown eyes curious rather than afraid. "Mister, why are you so angry? Did someone hurt your feelings?" The innocent question hit Alexander like a slap. Children weren't supposed to see through his carefully constructed armor. They weren't supposed to ask questions that made him uncomfortable. "Control your child," he snapped at Kira, his voice harsh. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. No discipline, no respect for authority." Kira's hand gently touched Luna's shoulder, a protective gesture so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Alexander noticed everything, and what he saw in that simple touch was a love so pure, so unconditional, that it made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "Luna, finish your drawing, sweetheart," Kira said softly, never taking her eyes off Alexander. "Sometimes people are angry because they're in pain, not because of anything we did." "I am not in pain," Alexander snarled, but even as he said it, something flickered across his face. For just a moment, the mask slipped, and Kira saw something raw and broken underneath. This wasn't their first encounter. For 3 months now, Alexander had made it his personal mission to make Kira's life miserable. He'd complained to the parks department about her unprofessional conduct, which consisted of letting Luna sit quietly nearby while she worked. He'd called city council members to question why people like her were allowed to bring their children to work. He'd even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on her, hoping to find something that would get her fired. What the investigator had found was a woman who worked 2 jobs to support her daughter, who had never been late or missed a day of work, and who was beloved by her coworkers and neighbors. The report had only made Alexander angrier. "I'm calling your supervisor," he said, pulling out his phone. "This ends today." "Mr. Voss," Kira said quietly, and the use of his name made him freeze. Of course she knew who he was, everyone in the city knew Alexander Voss, but there was something in the way she said it, something that made his blood run cold. "You know what?" she continued, standing up slowly, her city uniform wrinkled from kneeling by the trash bins. You should call my supervisor. In fact, you should call anyone you want. But before you do that, let me ask you something. Alexander's finger hovered over his phone screen, something in her tone making him hesitate. Do you sleep well at night, Mr. Voss? Do you have peaceful dreams? Or do you see the faces of people you've hurt? The phone trembled in Alexander's hand. What are you talking about? Kira tilted her head, studying him with those calm, knowing eyes. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, what are you going to do about it? For 10 years, Alexander Voss had been running from a night that had shattered more lives than he could count. For 10 years, he buried his guilt under layers of wealth and power and carefully constructed indifference. For 10 years, he told himself that what happened was just an accident, that everyone has moments they regret, that moving on was the only healthy choice. But standing there in the morning sun, looking into the eyes of a woman who somehow seemed to see straight through him, Alexander felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crack. I don't know what game you think you're playing, he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. But I'm done with this conversation. He turned to walk away, but Luna's voice stopped him. Mister, she called out, holding up her coloring book. I drew you a picture. Against his better judgment, Alexander found himself walking back. Luna had drawn a picture of 3 figures under a rainbow: a woman, a little girl, and a tall man in a dark suit. They were all holding hands and everyone was smiling. That's Mama, and that's me, and that's you, Luna explained proudly. I made you happy in my picture because Mama says everyone deserves to be happy even when they're mean. Alexander stared at the drawing, his carefully controlled world tilting on its axis. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, had drawn him into her family, had imagined him worthy of love and happiness despite his cruelty. Why? He whispered, the question escaping before he could stop it. Why would you want me to be happy? Luna looked at him with the simple wisdom that only children possess. Because you look so sad, mister. Even when you're being mean, your eyes look like you want to cry. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as emotions he'd suppressed for a decade came rushing to the surface. I have to go, he managed, his voice cracking. I have to ... He turned and fled, leaving behind his dignity, his composure, and a little girl who had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. But what Alexander didn't know was that this was only the beginning. In less than 24 hours, Luna Bennett would be fighting for her life, and he would be forced to confront not only his own cruelty, but the devastating secret that connected him to this family in ways he couldn't imagine. The next morning brought dark clouds and the promise of rain. Alexander sat in his corner office on the 47th floor of the Voss building, staring out at the city that had made him rich and powerful and empty. Luna's drawing sat on his desk, its bright colors a stark contrast to the cold steel and glass that surrounded him. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Luna's innocent face asking him why he was so angry. He heard Kira's voice asking about peaceful dreams and the faces of people he'd hurt. Most of all, he thought about a night 10 years ago that had changed everything. It had been raining that night, too. Alexander had been drinking at a business dinner, celebrating the closure of a major deal. He should have called his driver, but he was arrogant, invincible, drunk on success and expensive whiskey. He remembered the restaurant, Le Bernardin, one of the most expensive places in the city. He'd been dining with potential investors, men who controlled billions in capital, and the evening had been going perfectly. They'd agreed to fund his latest acquisition, a deal that would expand his empire into international markets. The champagne had flowed like water, and with each toast, Alexander had felt more untouchable, more certain of his own invincibility. To Alexander Voss, one of the investors had said, raising his glass, the man who turns everything he touches into gold. Alexander had smiled that night, basking in the praise, believing every word. He was 45 years old, worth more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, and the world was his playground. The rules that governed ordinary people didn't apply to him. He could buy his way out of any problem, charm his way through any obstacle, intimidate anyone who stood in his path. When the dinner ended at nearly midnight, his driver had been delayed, something about a family emergency. Any reasonable person would have waited or called a taxi. But Alexander wasn't reasonable that night. He was drunk on power and alcohol, and the idea of waiting for anyone, even for 10 minutes, was beneath him. I'll drive myself, he'd announced, ignoring the concerned looks from his companions. It's only 15 minutes to my penthouse. The rain had started as he pulled out of the restaurant's parking garage, his silver Porsche purring like a satisfied cat. The streets were slick and dangerous, but Alexander drove with the confidence of a man who believed the universe bent to his will. He was already planning his next move, already thinking about the headlines that would announce his latest triumph. The impact had come out of nowhere. A car pulling out of a parking lot, a father and daughter heading home from a late dinner. Alexander had been going too fast, his reflexes dulled by alcohol, and by the time he saw them, it was too late. Kai Bennett, 34, had died instantly. 6-year-old Sage Bennett had lived long enough to be rushed to hospital, long enough for her mother to say goodbye, long enough for Alexander to realize that he had destroyed a family. But Alexander Voss was worth billions, and billionaires didn't go to prison for accidents. His lawyers had descended like vultures, his money had flowed like water, and within 6 months, the case had been quietly settled. The Bennett family had received a substantial payout. The media had moved on to other stories, and Alexander had convinced himself that he'd done everything he could to make things right. He'd never learned the names of the people he'd killed. He'd never seen their faces or heard their stories. They'd been reduced to entries in a ledger, line items in a legal settlement, obstacles that his wealth and influence had simply moved aside. But now, staring at Luna's drawing, Alexander felt the truth settling into his bones like a disease. The woman in the park wasn't just some random person he'd chosen to torment. She was Kira Bennett, the wife and mother who had lost everything because of his carelessness. And Luna. Luna was the sister of the little girl he'd killed. The realization hit him with such force that he physically doubled over, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as bile rose in his throat. For 10 years, he'd been psychologically torturing the woman whose family he'd destroyed. For 3 months, he'd been trying to take away the livelihood of a mother who was still struggling to rebuild her life after his catastrophic intrusion into it. And through it all, Kira had known exactly who he was. She'd looked into the eyes of her family's killer every single day and chosen not to destroy him. She'd watched him attack her and her daughter with a cruelty that should have broken anyone, and she'd responded with a grace that he couldn't understand. Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call, but he ignored it. His assistant knocked on his door, but he waved her away. The Peterson merger that had seemed so important yesterday now felt like meaningless noise in a world that had suddenly become too large and too small at the same time. He had to do something. He had to find a way to make this right, to apologize, to somehow repair the damage he'd inflicted. But how do you apologize for destroying someone's family? How do you make amends for 10 years of unintentional psychological torture? How do you ask for forgiveness from someone who has already been showing you a mercy you don't deserve? Alexander was still wrestling with these questions when his phone rang again. This time he answered without looking at the caller ID. "What?" he snapped, his voice raw with emotion. "Mr. Voss?" It was Jennifer, his assistant, and she sounded shaken. "Sir, there's been an accident in Meridian Park. They're saying someone was seriously hurt and... Well, the police are asking if you were in the park this morning." Alexander's blood turned to ice. What kind of accident? "A little girl fell from one of the climbing structures. She's being rushed to Presbyterian Hospital and ... Mr. Voss. The officers mentioned that witnesses saw you talking to the family yesterday. They want to know if you saw anything that might help them understand what happened." The phone slipped from Alexander's numb fingers, clattering to the floor as the world tilted around him. Luna. Beautiful, innocent Luna, who had drawn him into her family picture, who had seen goodness in him when he couldn't see it in himself. Without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, Alexander grabbed his keys and ran for the elevator. He had to get to the hospital. He had to know if she was okay. He didn't know what he had to do, but he couldn't sit in his office while Luna was fighting for her life. The drive to Presbyterian Hospital was a blur of red lights and honking horns and traffic that seemed designed to keep him from where he needed to be. Alexander found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in decades, making bargains and promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "Please, let her be okay. Please, let me have the chance to make this right. Please, don't let my sins destroy another innocent life." When he finally reached the hospital, he saw Kira in the waiting room, still wearing her Parks Department uniform, her face a mask of controlled terror that Alexander recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror 10 years ago. She was alone, clutching a small backpack that probably contained Luna's things, and the sight of her isolation hit him like a physical blow. This was his fault. Not just the accident. He didn't even know if he was responsible for that, but the fact that she was facing this crisis alone. She should have had a husband beside her, a father for Luna to comfort and support her. Instead, she had no one because Alexander had taken that from her. He approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome, uncertain of everything except the need to be there. "Kira," he said softly, and she looked up with eyes red from crying. "Alexander," she replied, and there was no surprise in her voice, no anger, just a bone-deep weariness that made him want to weep. "I wondered if you'd come. How is she?" he asked, sitting down in the chair next to her without being invited, too desperate for news to worry about propriety. "They don't know yet." She fell from the top of the climbing structure, hit her head on the way down. "They're doing tests now, trying to determine if there's any brain damage, any internal injuries." Kira's voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Without thinking, Alexander reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. She didn't pull away, and somehow that small acceptance felt like more than he deserved. "She's strong," he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "She's going to be okay." Kira looked at him through her tears, and in her eyes he saw something that took his breath away. Not hatred, not blame, but a desperate need for hope, for someone to share her burden, for human connection in the face of overwhelming fear. "I can't lose her, Alexander," she whispered. "I can't lose another child. I can't survive it again." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with history and pain and a shared understanding of what loss could do to a human heart. Alexander felt his own tears begin to fall. 10 years of suppressed grief finally finding its way to the surface. "I know," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I know, and I'm so sorry for everything. For all of it." They sat together in silence, two broken people united by tragedy and the fierce love of a little girl who had somehow managed to see light in the darkest corners of both their hearts. Hours passed. Doctors came and went, their faces professionally neutral, their updates cautiously optimistic but frustratingly vague. Alexander found himself holding Kira's hand, offering what strength he had, accepting the strange comfort of her presence in return. It was well past midnight when Dr. Sarah Chun finally emerged from the surgical wing, her scrubs wrinkled, her face tired but smiling. "She's going to be fine," she announced, and Kira collapsed into Alexander's arms, sobbing with relief. "She has a concussion and some bruising, but no permanent damage. She was incredibly lucky. Can we see her?" Kira asked, wiping her eyes. "She's sleeping now, but you can sit with her. She should wake up in a few hours." As they walked toward Luna's room, Kira suddenly stopped and turned to Alexander. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "You've done enough, and I understand if this is too much." Alexander met her eyes, seeing himself reflected in their depths. Not the cruel, heartless man he'd become, but the person he'd once been, the person Luna had somehow glimpsed in her innocent drawing. "If it's okay with you," he said, "I'd like to stay. I'd like to be here when she wakes up." Kira studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I think she'd like that." Luna's room was small and sterile, filled with the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft whoosh of machines. She looked so tiny in the hospital bed, her dark hair spread across the white pillow, her face peaceful in sleep despite the bandage on her forehead. Alexander and Kira sat on opposite sides of the bed, maintaining a vigil that felt both strange and absolutely natural. They didn't talk much. There would be time for conversations later, time for explanations and apologies and the long, difficult work of figuring out how to move forward. For now, it was enough to be there, to watch over this precious child who had somehow managed to crack open two hearts that had been closed for far too long. As the sun began to rise outside the hospital window, Luna stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing as she took in her surroundings. "Mama?" she whispered, and Kira was instantly at her side, smoothing her hair and kissing her forehead. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Luna's gaze drifted to the other side of the bed, where Alexander sat with tears streaming down his face. A slow smile spread across her features. "Hi, mister," she said weakly. "Did you come to see if I was okay?" "Yes," Alexander managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I was very worried about you." "That's nice," Luna said, reaching out with her small hand. "Will you hold my hand?" Mama says holding hands makes everything better. Alexander looked at Kira, asking permission with his eyes. She nodded, and he gently took Luna's hand in his, marveling at how small and warm and perfect it was. Luna, he said, struggling to find the right words, I want you to know that I'm sorry for being mean to you and your mama. I was angry about things that weren't your fault, and that wasn't fair. Luna considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. It's okay, she said finally. Mama says sometimes grown-ups forget how to be happy, but they can remember if someone helps them. Your mama is a very wise woman, Alexander said, looking across the bed at Kira. And you're a very special little girl. I know, Luna said with a grin that lit up the entire room. Mama tells me that every day. As Alexander sat there holding Luna's hand, feeling her pulse steady and strong beneath his fingers, he realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The anger that had driven him for so long, the emptiness that had consumed him, the walls he'd built around his heart, they were all crumbling, replaced by something he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. Love. Not romantic love, but something deeper and more complex. The love of a man who had been given an undeserved second chance. The love of someone who had been shown mercy when he deserved judgment. The love of a heart that was finally learning how to heal. Over the following weeks, as Luna recovered and returned to her normal, exuberant self, Alexander began the long process of making amends. He didn't do it publicly or dramatically. There were no news conferences or grand gestures. Instead, he did it quietly, one small act at a time. He established a scholarship fund at the local elementary school in memory of Kai and Sage Bennett. He created a foundation to support single mothers in the city. He changed his company's policies to provide better support for working parents. Most importantly, he began to rebuild his relationship with Kira and Luna, not as the man who had destroyed their family, but as someone who wanted to honor their memory by becoming worthy of their forgiveness. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, moments of pain and awkwardness, times when the weight of history threatened to crush the fragile bonds they were building. But Luna's infectious joy and Kira's extraordinary capacity for grace carried them through the hardest parts. 6 months after that terrible night in the hospital, Alexander found himself back in Meridian Park, but this time as Luna's partner in a 3-legged race at the annual community picnic. Kira cheered them on from the sidelines, her laughter mixing with the sounds of children playing and families celebrating. As they crossed the finish line, dead last, but laughing so hard they could barely stand, Luna threw her arms around Alexander's waist. "We did it!" she cried. "We're a team!" "Yes," Alexander said, looking over her head at Kira, who was walking toward them with a smile that could have powered the entire city. "We are." That evening, as they sat together on a bench watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Kira finally asked the question that had been hanging between them for months. "Why?" she said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me that you knew who I was? Why did you let me think you were just some random cruel man instead of ... instead of him?" Alexander was quiet for a long time, watching Luna chase fireflies in the growing dusk. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with regret and wonder. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I couldn't face what I'd done, and it was easier to be angry at you than to be honest with myself. Because I thought if I could make you disappear, I could make the guilt disappear too." He turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had shown him a strength he'd never imagined possible. "But mostly," he continued, "because I didn't know it was possible to be forgiven for something like what I did. I didn't know that mercy was real, or that love could be stronger than hate. You and Luna taught me that." Kira reached over and took his hand, the gesture as natural as breathing. "We all make mistakes, Alexander. The measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, it's whether they get back up and do better." As Luna ran back to them, her face glowing with happiness and her pockets full of flowers she'd picked for both of them, Alexander realized that this was what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of revelation, but 1,000 small choices to be better, to love more, to let grace triumph over grief. He had been the most heartless man in America, a billionaire who had used his wealth and power to avoid confronting his own humanity. But sitting in that park, surrounded by the family he'd once destroyed and somehow been allowed to love, Alexander Voss finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. Some stories end with justice, others end with revenge. But the best stories, the ones that change hearts and heal wounds and remind us why hope is worth holding on to. Those stories end with forgiveness. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they end with love. If this story of transformation and second chances moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of human resilience and the power of forgiveness. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to change, and that mercy can triumph even in the darkest circumstances.